Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to the next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today is a very special seminar. We have some of us joining online and some of us joining in person, which we normally these are fully online, so it's quite exciting. And the reason we're having such a special event today is to celebrate Professor Richard Wortley. Professor Richard Wortley is a professor here at the University of Waikato in Te Puna Haumaru, which is the Centre for Security and Crime Science. Before that, he was the director of the Jill Dando Institute for Security and Crime Science at University College London. His research interests centre predominantly on the role of the immediate environment in crime and the implications for how we can then prevent crime by understanding that. He has more than 150 scholarly publications, including 5 authored books. So a really significant and sustained commitment to doing research in the area. So it's very exciting to have Richard speak with us today.
Thanks, April, for that very generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be giving this talk today. And in particular, because there are some people in the audience, I can get some immediate reactions, which can be a two-edged sword. I like people to smile and nod. That would be the most helpful to me. So I've actually been at Waikato nearly 6 years now, which time just seems to have flown, but mainly from living in Brisbane and coming over for a couple of weeks, a few times a year. And this is my last time, so it's very sad. And I hope I can still have some contact with the Waikato people. And really just want to have a little shout out to the Centre of Security Crime Science. It's a really terrific place, innovative, and I hope it grows and grows and grows. Anyway, my talk today is kind of in line with my general kinds of interests as April set them out, the situational aspects of homicide and variations across homicide types. So what I want to cover, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what a situational approach actually is. There'll be people here with backgrounds in criminology or forensic psychology who might know that, and people who might wonder why I'm emphasising this. So I just want to spend a few minutes covering that. Then I'll talk about this study. I mean, what I'm just doing today is describing an empirical study, which I'll go into the details of course, of some convicted homicide offenders. And I'll highlight the key findings from there that were about situational aspects. And then I'll talk about some summaries and implications and answer the so what question. So important, if you do some research, so what? Why have you done it and what use is it going to be put to? So let me talk a little bit about why a situational approach. So when we look at homicides, in actual fact, it's been long recognised by researchers in criminology and psychology that homicides have a significant situational aspect. As early as the 1920s and 1930s, criminologists were talking about how homicides might have been precipitated by things that the victim did. They're talking about how they tend to be located at certain places and the like. So they could see that homicides weren't necessarily what we see on TV, where someone meticulously plans to kill someone and goes through and carries that out, that often they're products of the moment. So we've known that for a long time, but there's remarkably little research that's actually looked at that. The implication of the situational approach is it shifts the focus from trying to understand the offender and what their propensities to commit crime are all about, how they were acquired, what we sometimes call distal causes of crime, to understanding the immediate causes of why that offence occurred at that certain period in time. And it's built on the principle that often propensity is not a really good predictor of a crime. Even the most criminally motivated offender doesn't commit crime 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They might commit crime relatively infrequently. Most of the time they're sleeping and having breakfast and doing all sorts of other things as well. So the question is, why do they commit crime when and where they do? Why does the offender go for 5 days a week and then suddenly decide to commit a crime at this place at this time? On the other side of the coin, lots of crimes are committed by people who don't have what we call criminal propensities. So why does that occur? So we know that, in the case of murderers, for example, we know many don't have previous offences, for example. We also, if we want to think a little bit about ourselves, we know that we're sometimes prone to do things that are just a little bit naughty or cheeky. We might not be entirely truthful on our tax returns, or we might take a few things from work because we're shorts and pens and so forth. We might run a few red lights and the like. So the idea of simply dividing the world up into offenders and non-offenders, I didn't think was very productive. And so we're interested in that kind of situational component. So, as I said, though, it's still a relatively under-researched area. By and large, there's a thing called the fundamental attribution error you may have heard of. Basically, as human beings, we want to try to understand events in terms of human agency. And so 99.9% of the books on crime and on homicide in particular are written by psychologists and criminologists are about why do people become offenders? Why do they become homicide offenders? What is it about their upbringing? What is it about their psychological makeup and so forth? They're still highly focused on propensity. They're not really theories of crime, they're theories of criminality. And a situational perspective takes us into a theory of crime. What is it about this situation that made crime occur? Whether that's committed by someone with a strong propensity to commit crime or someone who is not particularly motivated. And why am I interested in this? Because what we find is that this sort of information can have lots of useful information for immediate effect. It's really hard to change people's propensity. We know there's some efficacy, for example, in developmental interventions early in childhood. We know that can produce long-term effects, but we're looking at 15, 20 years for those outcomes to be achieved. With situational interventions, as we'll discuss as I go through this, we can do things today that will have an immediate effect on how the crime might have been committed. So that's an overview of why situations are important. I want to just go a little bit further. There's a distinct area of criminology called environmental criminology. And that is an area, it's relatively, as I've just said, it's a less popular or populated area than the traditional areas of criminology that are about propensity. But nevertheless, there's a dedicated group of people, like Lisa and April, who try to understand the situational aspects of crime. And there are what's called four core theories or approaches within that. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes describing each, how they help us understand homicide. You may have heard of some of these, you may not have, but that doesn't matter. So the first is the routine activities approach, and we associate with a fellow called Marcus Felsen. And this is really about how crime gets patterned by the everyday rhythms of life. For example, we know that assaults amongst young men, juvenile men, they tend to occur at 3:30 or so in the afternoon. They tend to occur within a couple of 100 metres of a school. Why is that? Well, because they get out of school. They've probably been niggling each other during the school hours, and that's when the assaults occur. We can't understand assaults amongst teenage boys unless we understand their routine patterns. We know, for example, that the most likely time for you to be pickpocketed or have something snatched out of your purse is around a transport hub at 5 in the afternoon. Why is that? Well, because that's when it's crowded, that's when people are leaving work, and offenders know that as well. So routine activities is about how these daily routines affect the way that offenders and victims might come together in vulnerable areas. And so for homicide, it would argue that homicides are most likely to argue in step with the rhythms of daily life that bring victims and offenders into situations that lack effective guardianship. So in other words, where and when do homicides occur? If we look at that, we might find some answers in the routine activities approach. Crime pattern theory takes this a little further. It looks at how that translates into the daily movements of people. And it argues that we know some of those locations where crime is most likely to occur. It's most likely to occur around where people live, for example, or it's most likely to occur around places that they visit regularly. And so in terms of homicide, they would hypothesize that some of the locations where victims and offenders converge are relatively stable and may experience disproportionate clustering. In other words, we should be on the lookout for hotspots for homicide. Are there some locations that are more likely for homicides to occur than others? Then the rational choice, by the way, just for completeness, crime pattern theory we associate with pattern Paul Brantingham mainly. Rational choice perspective, and we associate here Derek Cornish and Ron Clark. And this has a model of human action that's about people maximising the benefits that they're going to achieve through their behaviour and minimising the risks and the costs. And so Clark and Cornish argue that when a person gets to these locations where they're going to commit crime, they then make an assessment of whether they're going to proceed. They're going to assess whether they're going to get caught. They're going to assess what they actually want. What are they going to derive from it? And they're going to decide, is it worth me proceeding with that offence? And finally, the situational crime prevention approach, again, Ron Clark's mostly associated with this, argues that given the previous statement, we might be able to reduce crime and homicides in this case by reducing the opportunities in particular locations. How do we make it less easy and more risky for people to commit homicides so that their rational choice is to see the costs outweighing the benefits? So that's all I'm going to say about theory, but that kind of contextualises why we look at that and what the basic kinds of assumptions are of the environmental approach or the situational approach. Now, there's a slight complication here. I said that irrespective of that, homicide has been a topic of academic enterprise for the last 100 years. And in that time, two types of homicide have generally been identified: instrumental homicide and expressive homicide. This relates to other kinds of crime as well. So instrumental homicide is premeditated, the traditional sort of thing that you make TV programs about, where someone wants to hurt someone or kill someone because they're going to inherit money from them or they're going to steal things from them or whatever. And they make a plan and they make a rational choice to do that. Expressive homicides, on the other hand, are things that occur in the heat of the moment, out of anger, frustration, and so forth. That's all very well and good. So most studies suggest about 20% are instrumental and 80% are expressive. The problem with that from a situational perspective is it doesn't marry very, very well onto the rational choice perspective. Because if we look at that, it would say, if we took Ron Clark's idea that offending is largely instrumental, we'd suggest that maybe only 20% of homicides can be explained by environmental criminology, because the others are expressive. And I want to propose that the solution to that is to bring emotion into the environmental situational model. And that's something I've been working on for 20 odd years or so. And my approach is to come up with something called situational crime precipitators. And this is the idea that emotion is very, very important in crime. And often those emotions are actually generated by the situation themselves. So in other words, they're not just noise that interferes with someone's ability to make rational choices, although they do interfere with that to some extent. They're actually products of the situation. And if we can start to understand why people became aroused, then we can bring the idea of emotion into a situational analysis, into a rational choice analysis. And I think this is particularly crucial for homicide because of the preceding points, that in fact about 80% of homicides are thought to contain significant spontaneous emotional component. So we need to explain that, and I think the way to explain that and still retain a situational approach is to think about the idea of situational precipitators. So I think precipitators are important for two reasons. One is, as I said, they're actually products of the situation. And so we can ask, why did that person get angry? Why did they become so emotional? And can we do things to stop them becoming that emotional? And then if they are emotional, we need to factor that into their capacities to make rational choices. And a whole lot of work in cognitive psychology that looks at how emotion can change the way people see costs and benefits of events, and can play an important role in changing the way they see things. For example, we know that people in a very highly aroused state tend to be immediate focused as opposed to long-term focus. So it shifts their attention span from what might happen in a week from now or even 2 hours from now to what's happening right now. So the emotion changes the capacity for people to make rational choices. It changes the way they assess costs and benefits. One of the other aspects of high emotions is it can intensify the desired benefits of doing harm. If you're really angry with someone, the value of actually hurting them becomes more salient. So I think there are ways of bringing emotion into a situational perspective. It's been what I've been interested in really for the last 25 years, and I think it's absolutely crucial when we're thinking about homicide. I'll get to the study now. This study is part of the Australian Research Council Discovery Grant called the Australian Homicide Project, and my colleagues in this are Paul Mazerolle and Lee Eriksson and Holly Johnson. And we got this grant a few years ago to interview as many convicted homicide offenders as we could, and we ended up getting 302. Each participant was subject or agreed to be interviewed. All of the data were collected via interviews, but through a highly structured interview survey. So there was a very detailed survey, and for many answers there were alternative boxes that the interviewer could easily tick. And then if the participant said something differently, they could take notes. And so we have a combination of really tick the box and free response. But in each case, that was done by the researcher, and we didn't just leave them to read through and do the tick. So we had a very strict control over how it was answered. The study itself, as I said, the interviews went for over 2 hours. They were really long. Those of you who might have done some research in prisons, actually it can be surprisingly easy to get prisoners to take part, because even a 2-hour interview is a lot more interesting than sitting around in your cell. It covered a whole range of things: personal, family background, childhood experiences, offending history, relationships, drug and alcohol use, personality traits, had some structure, some standardized psychometric study papers there. And then finally, the circumstances of their current offence. So I've already written quite extensively on all of the above. If you do a search for the Australian Homicide Project or Eriksson, Wortley, Mazerolle, you'll come across, I guess, maybe 10 or so papers that we've already written. We've not done anything up to this point to circumstances around their offence, and that's what we're going to talk about today, finally. So, the current study. 2 research questions, very simple ones. What situational factors are associated with homicide? Very broad. Let's look at it. Let's get people to talk about that and see how situations influence them. And did these vary from across different kinds of homicides? There's lots of ways to categorise homicides. For example, expressive and instrumental is one. But probably the most common, and the one we adopted, is to think about the victim-offender relationship. We had 3 categories. Was the victim an intimate partner? Was it a relative or an acquaintance or friend of the offender? Or was it someone that they didn't know at all, a stranger? Maybe they just knew them just minutes before the offence. And there's the breakdown. We had, from the 302 who we interviewed, we had data on 260. Some of the offenders said they weren't guilty or proclaimed their innocence, so we excluded those. And we also excluded people who were in for filicide, for killing their own children, because we just felt they were quite different to all the others. So there's a breakdown. About a quarter in for an intimate partner, about 44% for friend and acquaintance, and 30% for stranger. These are the questions we asked, by and large, and we had follow-up questions for each of these. What we did is walk the participants through the day. What happened before the offence? How did the offence unfold? What happened after the offence? And we're just after them to describe, what were the sort of influences that they were subject to. So, key findings. Well, first of all, we just wanted to see the relationship between the three kinds of homicides that I talked about, intimate partner, known and stranger, with the sex of the victim and the offender. And these are the data here. So what does this show? Most offenders are male, and it's a disproportionate then ratio for female victims. Male victims are nearly 60%, ergo female victims are about 40%. So 10% of the offenders are female and 40% of the victims are female. And this particularly is a particular skew when you look at intimate partner, where 85% of the offenders were male and something like 84% of the victims were female, so highly skewed. Just interestingly, we looked at female offenders, interested in whether they were particularly active as intimate partner offenders, and there became no difference across the three categories. In each case, about 10% of the murders were female offenders. Okay, so how much forethought did they put into this? Did they plan it? Were they feeling angry for some time? What was going on here? The dark blue are intimate partners, the orange are friends and acquaintances, the green are strangers, and the blue is an aggregate of those. We asked them, had they been having violent thoughts about this person? And there was a significant difference for this. Least likely to have violent thoughts about the stranger, and this makes sense because you only knew the person for 2 or 3 minutes, whereas with people you knew, you had time to develop, some hostility towards them. The next is whether you made a decision to hurt. Now, there was no significant statistical difference here. We can see, for example, the decision to hurt seemed most apparent for strangers and known, but again, not statistically different. But again, less than 50% said that they made a conscious decision that I was going to hurt the victim. And did you actually make a plan? And now we're down to about 15%, and again, with no significant difference among the three categories. So by and large, according to offenders, and I'll come back to that as a caveat later on, according to offenders, most of their homicides were not planned, they didn't have a long history of hostility, and they tended to occur on the spur of the moment. We did ask those who said they had previous thoughts and plans and so forth, we asked them how long they'd had those. So, the dark blue one are violent thoughts, the orange one is a decision to hurt, and the green one is the plan to kill. By and large, if you had violent thoughts, you've probably been harbouring those for some time. On the other hand, if you made a decision to hurt, that probably was a spontaneous decision. Again, according to our... We asked them about their psychological state. So again, remember what we're saying is, how did you feel? If you're the researcher, you're saying, how did you feel just prior to the offence or before the murder? And then they would give an answer, and we had guessed, maybe a dozen of those, and we'd tick them if they said that they felt really angry. And in some cases, if they gave a free response, we'd code that later. For example, out of it, we didn't anticipate that, but a number of them said that they just didn't feel, they felt drug-induced or mentally disordered or whatever. So we look at the all to start with. Nearly 3/4 of them had consumed drugs and alcohol immediately prior to the homicide. Over half said that they felt angry. Nearly 20% said they felt scared. And you can go down the list. Multiple things, responses are possible. So, you could aggregate some of these together and maybe get to 70, 80%. If you look at individual differences, we found that stranger homicides were more likely to be associated with drugs and alcohol. And again, we start to build a picture here of fights that break out in round pubs and that kind of thing. Anger was most obvious for intimate partner homicide. Again, this kind of makes sense. You can think about partners, developing this kind of hostility towards each other over time. A normal, this really captures the idea, nothing out of the ordinary. No, I felt okay. And again, that's most likely with stranger danger, because probably 5 minutes before the murder occurred, there was no inkling that that would be the outcome. And depressed, again, associated very strongly with intimate partner homicides compared to others. So generally, again, participants are talking about their psychological states, are acknowledging that they were alcohol affected or drug affected, and that they had in some cases very intense emotional reactions. What were you doing immediately beforehand? Again, we just asked that as a question, and we anticipated that they'd be arguing or fighting with the victim, and indeed that's the most common responses were to be arguing with the victim, which is the first lot here. And this is, again, there were significant differences amongst the groups, with intimate partners saying that the homicide, in many cases, most cases, nearly 60% of cases, started with an argument. And then the same with, to a lesser extent, but similar for other people I knew, and then not so much for strangers. But then if we go over to fighting, which is physical as opposed to verbal, we find that fights are the most common precursor to homicide in stranger homicides. And the other relative friends, as happened with so many of the answers, kind of fell between the two poles of intimate partner, stranger. And it sort of had this mediocre kind of ground, which kind of makes sense. You know the person, you don't live with them, so you maybe have a different kind of a relationship with them, but you do know them, so they're not quite like strangers. Where did it happen? So this speaks to the routine activities theory a little bit, and these results are pretty standard. I think we could hypothesize these without too much trouble. Not surprisingly, intimate partner homicides tended to occur in a residential home, typically belonging to either the victim, the offender, or shared between the victim and the offender. And in some cases, someone else's home. On the other hand, stranger danger very rarely occurred in a residential home. They were much more likely to occur in public outdoor spaces or in other non-residential settings like pubs and so forth. And so, again, you can look at those data. I think they're interesting enough, but I think they're probably what you could have predicted from a logical point of view. Still, it speaks to what routine activities theory, is saying, that if we want to understand these offences, we need to understand under what circumstances people come together, the where and the when of it. When did it happen? So we start with midnight through to midnight, and we get kind of a U-shaped curve. And so most tended to occur late in the evening or in the early morning, with no significant difference among the groups. Again, routine activities theory. What we'd expect there's an aspect of routine activities theory that talks about the relationship between time and your freedom to do things. So, for example, for most of us, we're at university all day, either working or as students. That puts severe constraints on our ability to commit homicide, unless we happen to want to commit homicide against one of our fellow students or lecturers. But what you need, again, from a routine activities approach, is the time to do things when you're unconstrained by other duties and you're relatively unobserved by other people. And this tends to occur after work, and it tends to occur at night, and it tends to occur in private places. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's amazing how often people don't think about these simple but really important aspects when they're trying to understand crime and homicide in particular. Did they use a weapon? Well, I think this is really interesting. Again, about a quarter said they didn't. So again, we can think about impulsivity. If I was going to commit a murder, I think I'd probably arm myself in some way, but about a quarter didn't. So what happened there? These again if you think about it's most common with strangers, so this is the sort of thing that occurs with pub brawls and the like. In terms of weapon use, these have distinct Australian and perhaps Antipodean flavours in that the most common weapon is a knife, although this is also same as the UK, and the firearm is the third most popular, in fact not very popular at all, around 16%. If you look at American data, you find quite a different pattern. You find 2/3 of all homicides involve a firearm. So to keep that in mind, because that then plays into what we might start recommending for crime reduction. I don't know if there's anything else. Heavy rock and a hammer. Also was the second most common type of weapon. And that one's important for this reason. Where do we get the weapon? Again, if you have a propensity kind of argument, you're going to imagine people bringing weapons with them because they know that they're going to hurt someone, or at least that's part of their possibilities of what they might be doing. On the other hand, what we found was quite a high proportion, nearly half. So in just under half of the cases, the offender, where offenders had a weapon, they brought it with them. So we can infer some kind of instrumentality from that, I think. No matter what else offenders say about their intentions, that half of them brought a weapon along probably undercuts a little bit the idea that they didn't have any thought of hurting the other person. What I find interesting is that if you add that the victim had it and at the scene, you get over 50% were obtained at the crime scene, either because it was lying there or because the victim had it. And not surprisingly, at the scene was particularly for a heavy object. So a rock or a hammer that happened to be lying there, but also quite high levels for a sharp object. Where am I finding it? Yeah, sharp object. Tending to find those at the scene. And again, you start imagining this, starting to put some flesh around this. You can imagine a husband and wife arguing in the kitchen and the carving knife laying there on the table. I'm mentioning these not because I'm making them up, but these data came from really detailed qualitative data that the offenders provided, and I've read those. And that's exactly the sort of thing that happened, that the fight would start and they would grab out something that happened to be handy. So after that happened, we asked them had they planned it. And one of the confusing aspects of that is it's difficult to know what they interpret planning means or intention means. What if they made that intention 2 seconds before the crime? It's a little bit ambiguous. So we asked them again, after it happened, in retrospect, what had you meant to happen? And for about 35%, we were able to categorise that as they didn't want to hurt or kill the person. That's what they're saying. About 20% said that they did want to hurt them, but they weren't intending to kill them. And then just 15 said, no, I was going to kill them. That was what I wanted to do. And then there was another quarter who basically provided really concrete responses, such as, I just wanted her to stop shouting at me, or I just wanted to get some money off him or her. So we couldn't really categorise that in terms of these more basic categories. So again, some of this speaks to instrumentality. Certainly, if you ask people why did you kill the person, and they can say, I wanted them to give me money, then I think you can infer some instrumentality there as well. Anyway, 84% said they didn't intend to do it. So we need to take that on board and think about what that means. Finally, we're interested in who witnessed it. This question, again, partly influenced by the routine activities approach. Were they going to commit these offences in public? Was it possible for people to have intervened or not intervened? Just what's going on there? And not surprisingly, the majority had no witnesses. And again, not surprisingly, that was most common for intimate partner homicides, which tended to occur in residences. And when they did occur, then they were mostly known people, except for stranger homicides where there were more likely to be unknown adults. And once again, a common scenario here is people, fights breaking out in the street or fights breaking out at pubs where there are a mix of people. We dug a little bit deeper there. We asked whether any of the witnesses intervened. 63% said that they didn't intervene. 89% said the presence of a witness there didn't affect the way that I behaved. And 11% said actually made it worse. And they recounted situations where witnesses would egg them on. Go on, get him, go after him. Don't let him do that. So again, an interesting role that certainly no sense of guardianship here, quite the reverse. We have provocateurs. And then we asked them how they felt after the offence. Same story here. We had some guesses that we could tick, and then they gave us other ones that we coded later. So around 20% said they were sad. Some, nearly the same, said they were scared. Some said they were shocked. I can't believe I did it, that kind of stuff. Or disbelief is the same thing. Now, clearly you could give multiple responses here, and clearly there are overlaps between them. So we combined all of the ones that tended to show some level of regret or remorse or sadness. And if you answered at least one of those, we created a new category called combined distress or remorse. And I guess coming out there, sort of more than 50% said at the end of the day that they felt remorseful in that way. Some maintained they were still angry at the victim. A small percentage, particularly in stranger homicides, felt elated and excited and got a real buzz out of it. So we don't have a single kind of response pattern here. Okay, so that takes us through just some of the situational things that our sample revealed to us. As I said, the point of doing this is that we think it has some important implications. So let's look at those. Well, I think there are some findings that relate back to routine activities. We know that most offenders and victims knew each other, over 60%. We know that most homicides occurred in private residences and at night in the absence of potential guardianship. In common with previous studies, we found that we could probably classify most, perhaps 80% or maybe more likely 75% of the homicides as expressive. So what data shows us this? Few offenders said they planned or intended to kill the victim. Most were emotionally aroused before the event and remorseful after the event. About 3/4 were affected by drugs or alcohol. More than half the homicides were the end point of an argument or a fight. In fact, that's about 60%. A quarter of homicides didn't involve a weapon, and more than half of the weapons that were used were obtained at the crime scene itself. Having said that, it's not all about expressiveness, and what I don't want to present is, in fact, the more recent research is showing that expressive and instrumentality is not a dichotomous measure, that there's a mix of them. Some are highly instrumental, about planned, unemotional homicides. Some are about explosive losses of control, and most are kind of a mix between those. And I think that's the best way to understand our findings. If we think, well, let's look at the evidence of instrumentality, and I'll think about knitting them together a little bit. About half made a decision to hurt the victim, and a quarter sought them out. So about 25% said they had. What were you doing with the offender with the victim before the offence? I was trying to find them. I picked them. I wanted to confront them or whatever. In a third of cases, they actually brought the weapon to the offence. So again, suspicious. 38% said they had intended to hurt but not kill the victim. So, they're still admitting to that amount. While a quarter articulated specific outcomes like get money, tell her, just get her to stop shouting at me, and so forth and so forth. And there's some offenders who actually express no guilt, express relief, were somewhat elated and found the whole thing kind of exciting and were most concerned about what was going to happen to them now, as opposed to what they actually did. So a mix of things. Like I say, I think my view of this is that the situational precipitators are very important. The idea of being in an argument and or actual fist fight are actually fundamental to understanding 60% of these offences. But that's not to say that the offender lost all agency. I'm not subscribing to the idea that in those emotional states you lose control. And if we go then back to cognitive psychology, that talks about it as an impairment more so than this total loss of control. So I think there's still room to be thinking about the role of emotion and how important it is in homicide, while recognising that it's also a purposive act in many cases. It's an act where someone is trying to achieve an outcome, even if that outcome is kind of macabre, to end the life of a fellow human being. If we think about the second hypothesis, which was, does this vary across offence types? Let's just look at each one separately. Intimate partner homicides, most likely to occur in residential locations. Well, yes. Less likely to be associated with drugs and alcohol. That's perhaps surprising. High levels of anger and depression. I think we'd expect that. More likely to result from an argument and less likely from a fight. If we think particularly about the power differential between men and women, I think we can understand that a fist fight is not going to be a logical outcome in many cases. It's more likely to be an argument. And higher levels of regret and distress after the event. For known victim homicides, few distinguishing features. As I said, it tended to sit between the other two and is more described in terms of which one it favoured at any particular time. Stranger homicides, though, low level of violent thoughts about the victim, more likely to occur in public and non-residential areas, high prevalence of a fight and lower prevalence of arguments, less likely to involve a weapon and more likely to feel okay before the event and after the event. So again, I think the picture here is people who have just met each other, have somehow got into an argument, perhaps alcohol-fueled argument, somewhere perhaps in the night economy or whatever, and that's kind of the standard pattern or typical pattern. I won't dwell on this. If you've done any work in this area, you'll know that there's a table of situational prevention techniques. And basically, if we want to intervene here, then we need to do one of these 5 things. We need to try to increase the effort, increase the risk, reduce the rewards, remove excuses. And what I'd argue in this case in particular, we need to reduce those provocations or those things that trigger those emotional precipitators. It seems to me almost uniquely should be applied in the homicide area. Okay. There are some challenges. First of all, 60% occurred in residences. How in the world do we intervene there from a situational perspective? Well, there are things we can do, I'll talk about, but it obviously cuts down our options. Much easier, for example, to intervene at pubs and nightclubs and so forth that might be hotspots. But in fact, there are very few hotspots. Because homicide's a rare event, we have the black swan phenomenon, in that it's one of those offences where it's not easy to measure, not easy to find a hotspot that we can concentrate on. Right, this pub here has had 50 murders in the last year. That's not going to happen. And not only that, it's because things are spread out like that, and there are very few locations that are hotspots. We don't have the data to be able to see whether things work. So a lot of the work in this area has been to make suggestions, to suggest ways that you can intervene at an environmental level. But there's probably little chance that we'll ever find empirical data to show that. Now, there are exceptions. There's a recent paper by Josh Freilich that analysed school shootings in the US and rated each school in terms of the kinds of physical security things that they had in place, and was at least able to show that the severity of the school shooting was inversely related to the presence of things like having to report to the office before you went in, CCTV and those kinds of traditional situational strategies. So it is possible. The other way it's possible to overcome the black swan area is to have highly aggregated data, and most of the research there has been done in restrictions on firearms, and I won't review that. I mean, it's slightly contentious. To me, I think it's pretty clear that restricting firearms has a positive effect or negative effect on the number of murders, and we only need to compare the US with other countries to bear that out. So that's some ways of doing it. I think another strategy, because of the black swan problem, is to reframe the problem or reframe the task. Rather than think about how can we stop using situational prevention, how can we stop homicides, there might be some value in thinking about how can we stop domestic disputes that might lead to homicide? How can we stop pub violence or violence in the nighttime economy that might lead to homicide? And there's a much larger research base there and more chance, I think, of being able to demonstrate results. For example, some early research I was involved in the Gold Coast in Australia showed that you can have significant decreases in nightclub-related violence by doing simple things with the design of the nightclubs, making sure that they enforce not serving intoxicated patrons. One of the simplest things was to change floor patterns so that the pathway to the bar didn't intersect with the pathway to the toilets. You can find a lot of those kinds of things tend to increase violent offences. Now, we can't say that, the vast majority of those don't end in murder. But in terms of a research challenge, I just don't think we're ever going to be able to conclusively show that some of those situational strategies are effective. But in my heart, I know that they would be. I want to just talk about some limitations. These are self-report data. Now, that's a strength. There's very little research in this area, but the research that exists is almost all done from official reports, where researchers are inferring intentions and inferring emotions. We could find only 2 previous studies, that actually involved interviews with convicted offenders. So our study joins that small group, and I think we're able to get into the weeds, if you like, talking about their intentions and their emotions in a way that previous studies haven't. On the other hand, we're relying on just the honesty of participants, but also their capacity to give reasonable responses. I think if I was a participant in this study, I'd probably try to present myself in as a positive way as possible, particularly given it was an interview situation, actually, because that in some ways reduces the sense that it's anonymous, because you're actually talking to another human being. So I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt. I think there's enough evidence to say that a lot of these things did happen fairly spontaneously and were products of the situation. I think there's less evidence to say that the offender had no control over their behaviours and weren't engaging in purposive actions. So we need to keep those in mind. There's some possible confounds in a paper I've just submitted for publication. We also looked at the victim's sex, the offender's sex, and the offender's age, and there's a few confounds there. If you think about intimate partner homicide, sure, one of the key variables is that they are related to one another, in an intimate relationship, but they also tend to be older, and they tend to have more female victims and so forth. So there's some possible confounds there to sort through. And the other is, as I alluded to earlier, I've actually read through some of the transcripts where offenders just give a free response to what happened that day. And I've got to say, they were much more compelling than what I've just told you now, in a sense that aggregating the data in this way kind of squeezes out some of the nuance. And so we are planning with our colleague Devon Polchek to now go back to those qualitative studies and try to maybe put a bit more flesh on it and make it a little bit more nuanced and alive. Thank you.